Well, it has certainly been a while. Um I'm MDR. I've been busy these past few months, I guess. I don't know. I'm just gonna post the video. I'm gonna do a reaction real quick, and then I'm gonna try to upload more. Um I really do wanna start making videos again, so we're gonna do that. We'll start it off with a reaction. It is by Serious History. The video is Most Epic Survival Stories in History.
Thank you to ZocDoc for helping us make this video. Today we're going over the most epic survival stories in history. Poon Lim. It's November 23rd, 1942, and 24-year-old Poon Lim is desperately clinging to a wooden plank in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. Just moments earlier, he had been a steward aboard the SS Ben Lomond, a British merchant marine ship on its way to New York. Without warning, two massive explosions ripped through the vessel, and Lim was swept overboard. Fighting against the pull of the now sinking ship, he frantically swam toward what he hoped was the surface, his lungs burning for air. When he finally broke through, he looked around only to see the endless ocean stretching in every direction. He was completely alone. As he bobbed in the frigid water, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him, the German U-boat that had fired the torpedo suddenly surfaced. Its crew climbed onto the deck, and Poon Lim waved frantically, shouting for help. The Germans spotted him and burst into laughter. They mockingly waved back before again disappearing beneath the waves, leaving him to die. After 2 agonizing hours of drifting, Lim spotted a sign of hope. One of the few life rafts the crew of Ben Lomond had managed to launch before the ship went down was floating just a few hundred feet away. He desperately swims toward it and drags himself aboard. In the distance, he sees another raft carrying a handful of other survivors, and they begin waving for him to join them. But with no oars to steer, the raft slowly drifted apart until once again, he was completely alone. Aboard the raft, Lim finds some food, water, and signaling supplies. He began rationing carefully, clinging to hope that rescue would come soon, but days stretched into weeks, and his supplies dwindled to nothing. Realizing he would probably run out of food before he was rescued at this rate, Lim made a desperate decision. He would save his last piece of hardtack not to eat, but to use as bait. He fashioned a fishing hook from the spring in his flashlight and unraveled hemp rope for a fishing line. Surprisingly, the fish seemed to like the hardtack more than the sailors ever did, but his hook was too small to catch anything substantial. Using a nail he pried from the raft, he made a bigger hook and used the small fish he had been able to catch as bait. As his fresh water supply ran out, he rigged a canvas shelter to catch rainwater to drink. When seagulls began landing on his raft, Lim caught them for food as well. With no way to cook the birds, he butchered them, soaked the meat in seawater, and dried it into jerky under the scorching sun. Though the supplies he found on the raft had completely run out, he was now catching enough food to survive. But then the rain stopped completely, and soon he was left with nothing to drink. Sunburned and delirious with thirst, he watched as sharks began circling his raft. In this moment, Lim comes up with an idea only a man staring at death could come up with. But before we get into that absolute crazy thing that Poon Lim does to find something to hydrate with,
what's he gonna do?
Have you ever wondered if your weird symptoms are also just from dehydration or something much more serious? Oh no, I think I do have. Using seagull remains as bait, he tries to catch one of the sharks. He gets a bite and he uses all of his strength to pull the giant fish out of the water. Desperate beyond reason, he cuts it open and drinks the blood from its liver. A few days later, a cargo ship appears and Lim shouts to them in English, begging them to save him. But they ignore his request, the crew assuming he was a Japanese sailor. Later, American Navy patrol planes spot him and drop a buoy to mark his location for rescue. But before they could return, a violent storm swept Lim and his raft away into the vast ocean. Months pass, and Poon Lim gives up counting the days he has been lost at sea. Starving and sunburned, he's about to give up. But one morning, while gazing out at the water, he noticed something different. The color of the ocean had changed. He had drifted closer to shore. But
no way.
Where was he? And more crucially, could he survive long enough to be found? Finally, on April 5th, 1943, 4 months after the Ben Lomond's sinking, a Brazilian fishing boat spotted him just 9 miles off the coast of northern Brazil. Using the last of his strength, he stands and shouts for help, and the fishermen come to his rescue. By this point, Lim had lost 20 pounds and was so weak the fishermen had to lift his emaciated body from the raft into their boat. In a Brazilian hospital, Lim learned he was the sole survivor from his ship. He had survived for 133 days drifting alone in the Atlantic Ocean. Poon Lim makes a full recovery and is later told that no one had ever survived longer on a raft at sea. He quickly replied, "I hope no one will ever have to break that record." Hugh Glass.
W.
It's August 1823, and a fur trapper named Hugh Glass is traveling along the
Hugh
Grand
Glass.
River in what is now modern-day South Dakota. This particular expedition was deep into Arikara Indian territory, which made it particularly dangerous. But soon, Hugh would be fighting for his life against something much more fierce.
Do a trick shot?
While scouting ahead of his party for river crossings, Hugh inadvertently stumbles upon a mother
trick shot that bear
with her cubs.
Trick shot
The
that
mama bear, on
motherfucker.
instinct to protect her young, lunges at Hugh and instantly begins to maul him. The bear tears deep gashes on his back and chest, exposing his ribs, breaks his leg, and slices his throat. The other trappers hear his screams and come running, finding Hugh being literally torn apart. They open fire, finally bringing down the beast. Hugh lies in a pool of his own blood, a mangled wreck that barely resembles a human being. Everyone present knows they're looking at a dead man walking. Or, rather, a dead man that had just been crumpled into a pretzel, I guess. They fashion a makeshift stretcher and drag him along for 2 days, but his weight slows their progress to a crawl through dangerous territory.
Oh my God.
Expecting Glass to die at any moment, the expedition leader offers $80 for volunteers to stay with him until the end and give him a proper burial. An old trapper named John Fitzgerald and a young man named Jim Bridger step forward, thinking they've just scored the easiest money of their lives.
Do it,
Oh my God.
now. Spritz it good. Rub it on your body just like you should.
But days pass, and Hugh Glass refuses to die. Fitzgerald and Bridger watch as Hugh drifts in and out of consciousness. Each time they think he's gone, he lets out another painful groan. Poor old Hugh. It won't be long now.
How does he survive that?
Yep, any minute.
At that point, just start bringing him back. I can't lie.
Oh my god, just fucking die already. Knife and supplies and a bait. Oh my god, just fucking die already. 5 days pass and Hugh is still not dead. The trappers begin to panic. What if the Indians find them? They'd be sitting ducks. Hugh is obviously not gonna make it, and there's no reason for him to take them with him. So in a moment of cold calculation, they decide to take Hugh's rifle, knife, and supplies and abandon him alone in the wilderness. Fitzgerald and Bridger quickly catch up with the main expedition and report that Hugh Glass had passed away. The other men accept this without question. After all, they'd seen what the guy looked like when they left. But against all odds, Hugh Glass did not die, and he finally wakes up only to find himself all alone and stripped of all his weapons and supplies. Enraged that Fitzgerald and Bridger had left him to die, he tries to stand but discovers his shattered leg won't support him and his entire body is covered with deep wounds. With grim determination, he sets his own broken leg and begins an impossible 200-mile journey toward Fort Kiowa, crawling on his belly
if he
like a
survives
broken
that-
animal. Every day he drags himself a few agonizing miles, eating berries, roots, bark, and bugs to survive. Maggots hatch from fly eggs in his festering wounds and begin devouring the rotting flesh on his back, which is super gross,
God.
but actually probably saved his life by preventing a deadlier infection that would have killed him. While any sane man would have surrendered to death, Hugh is driven by one burning obsession: revenge against the men who betrayed him, so he continues to drag himself along the river. But by this point, Hugh was starving. The berries and bugs he had been eating were not enough. He discovers a pack of wolves feasting on a freshly killed buffalo calf. When the wolves leave, he crawls to the carcass and claims it as his own, setting up camp and gorging himself on meat until his leg heals enough for him to limp onwards. Hugh reaches the Missouri River, and there, some friendly Lakota Indians give him a boat which he uses to float downstream. Finally, in October of 1823, Hugh Glass limped into Fort Kiowa. Against all odds, he had survived not only a vicious grizzly bear attack that should have killed him, but also a 6-week, 200-mile journey back through the wilderness, all alone. Now, for most people, surviving such an ordeal would probably be the end of their life on the frontier. But Hugh Glass couldn't forget the men who had left him to die. He wanted revenge, so as soon as he fully recovered, he bought a new rifle and supplies and set out to hunt down Fitzgerald and Bridger. For months, Hugh tracked through the wilderness, following the trail of the expedition that had written him off as dead. And on New Year's Eve, 1823, he walked into Fort Henry and found his former companions. The trappers stared in absolute terror as they watched a man who they thought was dead walk directly towards them. Once they confirmed he wasn't a ghost that was trying to haunt them, they peppered Hugh with questions, which he answered patiently. Finally, it was his turn to speak, and Hugh just had one question of his own. Where are Fitzgerald and Bridger? Bridger is called, and the young man cannot believe his eyes. Though Hugh intended to kill him, their conversation reveals that Fitzgerald was the one who decided to abandon him. Hugh forgives the young man and sets out to find and kill Fitzgerald, who had since left the party. For the next 6 months, Hugh wandered from fort to fort, searching for his betrayer, and finally, in June 1824, Hugh Glass walked into Fort Atkinson and finds Fitzgerald. Hugh draws his gun and walks into the fort, but is stopped by a U.S. Army captain. Hugh demands a face-to-face meeting with Fitzgerald so he can give him what he has coming to him, but his long-awaited revenge was immediately crushed. The captain informed Hugh that Fitzgerald had enlisted in the U.S. Army and was now government property. He would not allow Hugh to harm him. Glass pours out his story about how he was abandoned and left for dead by Fitzgerald, and the captain understands how that probably was pretty infuriating, so he tells Hugh to wait a moment. He returns with Hugh's rifle that Fitzgerald had taken and $300. Happy to have his rifle back, but still bummed he couldn't get his revenge, Hugh shouts a warning to Fitzgerald, who remained in hiding. Never leave the army! Because if you do, you'll be dead. Hugh Glass then turns and leaves the fort, returning to life as a fur trapper, which he does for another 10 years until the Arikara finally killed him. Bro really should have retired. The HMS Endurance.
What if you can
he definitely should have retired.
Saying, this is what I want.
That was a crazy story though.
1914, and Sir Ernest Shackleton is sailing toward Antarctica aboard the HMS Endurance with a crew of 27 men. The early 20th century was the golden age of Antarctic exploration, and Shackleton was one of the greatest heroes of the era. In a previous expedition, he had come within just 97 nautical miles from becoming the first man to reach the South Pole, but he was forced to turn back when he ran out of supplies. Before he could attempt it again, Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen beat him to the prize, which was super frustrating. Now 40 years old, Shackleton knew time was running out on his career as an explorer. If he wanted to secure his place in history, he would need to achieve something even greater than reaching the South Pole. And that was exactly what this expedition aimed to do. Shackleton planned to be the first man to walk across the entire Antarctic continent, passing through the South Pole. This would probably take an entire Antarctic summer. His team would need to be perfect, but Shackleton was confident they could make history by accomplishing the impossible. But as the Endurance entered the Weddell Sea, Shackleton and his crew could see that something was not right. This should have been the peak of the Antarctic summer, yet due to unusual weather that year, the sea was choked with ice. As the Endurance pushed closer towards the continent, the ice grew thicker and more threatening, and by January, the ship was completely frozen in place. Shackleton's crew tried desperately to chip away the ice and free the Endurance, but it was hopeless. Soon the brief summer season had passed, and without any other option, they were forced to wait until the ice would break during the next spring. For 8 brutal months, the crew survived on the ship, enduring the savage Antarctic winter. Shackleton worked tirelessly to maintain his men's morale, organizing games and sing-alongs, But in his private journal, he confessed his deepest fears about their situation. His only goal now was getting his men back home alive. In September 1915, the ice around the Endurance began to melt. The crew initially celebrated, thinking they were finally free. They had no idea their nightmare was about to become so much worse. As the ice melted, massive chunks began pressing against the ship. As the pressure from the ice sheets grew worse, the damage became so bad that by October 24th, water was pouring into the cabin. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship, and the crew frantically unloaded supplies onto the ice sheet before watching the Endurance disappear beneath the surface forever. Shackleton hoped the ice sheet would drift them close enough to an island where he had cached supplies, but as the Antarctic summer progressed, the ice literally melted beneath their feet. Food grew scarce, and eventually the sled dogs were shot to provide meat for the starving crew. Shackleton led desperate marches across the shifting ice floe, trying to reach solid land, but every attempt failed. They had to establish new camps while the ice was rapidly disintegrating beneath them. On the evening of April 8th, the ice sheet the crew was camped on suddenly began to split apart. Shackleton immediately ordered his crew to load the 3 remaining lifeboats from the Endurance and set off as their previous campsite crumbled apart. As they sailed through the night, one boat was lost in the darkness, crushing the spirits of the survivors. Shackleton had initially planned to head for Deception Island, but it proved deceptively difficult to reach. With his crew freezing in -20 Fahrenheit temperatures, he was instead forced to land on the barren wasteland of Elephant Island. As the men from the 2 surviving lifeboats unloaded their meager supplies, they spotted something miraculous on the horizon. The 3rd lifeboat had somehow found them. The crew reunited in tearful celebration, but reality soon set in. Elephant Island was a frozen hell. No whaling ships visited this desolate rock, and it had virtually no wildlife to sustain them. If they remained here, it would mean a slow, cold death for everyone. These men had trusted Shackleton with their lives, so he decided to risk his own to save them. He ordered his carpenter to repair and modify one of the lifeboats, the James Caird, which he and 5 others would use to attempt an 800-mile journey to South Georgia Island. He selected navigator Frank Worsley to join him, and he would assign him the near impossible job of guiding their tiny boat across some of the most dangerous waters on Earth, using only a map and a sextant. Shackleton packed enough food for 4 weeks, assuming that if they hadn't found land by then, they would have overshot their target and would be doomed anyway. The 6-man crew launched from Elephant Island on April 24th, putting their lives entirely in Frank Worsley's hands. For 14 hellish days, the James Caird was battered by 20-foot waves while ice formed on the boat and crew. Worsley navigated from memory and the few precious hours of daylight each morning provided. Finally, on May 8th, South Georgia Island appeared through the mists like a mirage. The tiny boat made landfall 2 days later. Against all odds, Worsley had successfully guided them to their destination. Though they had made it to the island, the 6 men were far from rescued. The James Caird had landed on the south side of the island, while the whaling stations Shackleton desperately needed were on the opposite side. He could either try sailing around the island, risking being blown off course, or attempt something that had never been done, climbing over the glacial mountains that stood between him and civilization. Shackleton chose Worsley and another sailor to accompany him on his final gamble. With no map to guide them, they set out at 2 a.m. on May 19, 1916, and began up the mountain. By dawn, they had climbed to 3,000 feet and could see the whaling station in the distance, but they were heartbroken to discover they were traveling in the wrong direction. They had to backtrack and continue through the night in complete darkness.
With Google Play Games, you can play Unlocked.
I'm a changed man.
Unlock.
I don't rage.
By the next morning, they could make out the whaling station far below, and at 7 a.m., they heard a steam whistle, the first human sound they had heard in 2 years that wasn't their own. On the morning of May 20th, 3 skeletal figures with matted hair and wild beards stumbled into the Stromness whaling station. The whalers didn't believe the man claiming to be Ernest Shackleton. He had disappeared 2 years ago and was presumed dead. Only when Shackleton called the station manager he had met prior to the voyage by name did they finally believe him. Shackleton immediately convinced the whalers to help him rescue his men. The very next day, the 3 crew members from the James Caird, who were stranded on the other side of South Georgia, were rescued by a whaling boat guided by Shackleton himself.
Not
3
bad.
days later, Shackleton set off in a whaling ship to rescue the rest of his men on Elephant Island. But winter was setting in, and the island was surrounded by an
No.
impenetrable ice pack. Shackleton desperately attempted to reach Elephant Island in July, but the ice was still too thick, and an August attempt also failed. 3 months had passed since Shackleton had left his men on that frozen rock, and he begged the Chilean Navy for
no.
assistance. They provided him with a steam tug that finally broke through to Elephant Island on August 30th. As the fog lifted around the ship's approach, Shackleton wondered if anyone could still be alive. He had left them in such a horrible place, but soon he was overwhelmed with relief as he saw his men
my
waving at him from
God.
the shore. They had survived, every single one of them, and within an hour, they were all aboard the rescue vessel. Against all odds, every member of Shackleton's crew from the HMS Endurance had survived 2 years in the most hostile environment on Earth. When Shackleton planned another
That's
Antarctic expedition in
amazing.
1922, many men from the crew of the Endurance volunteered to join their captain on another adventure. Tragically, just before this new adventure could begin, Shackleton died of a heart attack on South Georgia Island, the very same island where he had risked everything to save his crew just 6 years earlier.
Aw. That's a sad ending. That was a really sad ending. What the hell?